The announcement came like a thunderclap through Windsor and rippled across every corner of royal reporting. King Charles has officially ordered the transfer of Royal Lodge, the ivy-draped mansion long tied to the York family, to Prince Edward and his wife, Sophie. It is, by all accounts, a decisive royal decree, and according to palace insiders, a clear signal that the new reign intends to tidy up the lingering mess left from previous decades. But for Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, the decision felt like an open wound. "It's not just a house," one close friend reportedly said. "It's her last link to the world that cast her out." Within hours of the news, royal correspondents began dissecting the meaning. The Royal Lodge, a stately property tucked inside Windsor Great Park, has been home to Sarah and her ex-husband, Prince Andrew, since the early 2000s. The residence was granted to Andrew by Queen Elizabeth II in what was described at the time as an act of maternal indulgence, an attempt to shield her second son after his marriage collapsed. But now, with Andrew stripped of all official duties, and Sarah increasingly seen as an awkward relic from a scandal-ridden past, the property has become the latest casualty of King Charles's mission to streamline the firm. "I'll lose. This is Charles's line in the sand," a former royal staffer told a journalist for the Mail on Sunday. He wants no ambiguity, no leftover symbols of the old York influence cluttering the landscape of the modern monarchy. And yet, behind palace walls, sources whisper that this decision was far from unanimous. Queen Camilla, according to one insider, saw the Yorks as an unresolved threat to the crown's clean image, while Anne, the Princess Royal, reportedly argued for a quieter resolution, one that wouldn't humiliate Sarah publicly. The internal divisions only made the decree feel more dramatic. For Sarah, the shock was immediate and personal. Friends describe her receiving the letter while taking tea in the drawing room at Royal Lodge, the same room where she once hosted charity galas and family Christmases. She was, they say, pale but composed, staring at the royal crest on the envelope before realizing what it meant. The lodge, her last stronghold, was being reassigned. Not to strangers, but to Edward and Sophie, the so-called model couple of the monarchy, who have spent years cultivating an image of reliability and humility. The symbolism couldn't be sharper. As one commentator put it on Sky News, "It's the quiet ones who always end up winning." Behind the scenes, royal aides insist the move is practical, not punitive. The Royal Lodge, they argue, needs to serve a fuller public function, rather than stand as a semi-private retreat. But others read it differently. "It's a public humiliation, wrapped in administrative language," said a longtime royal watcher. "They're reclaiming territory, literally and symbolically." And while Edward and Sophie maintain a dignified silence, the decision cements their growing prominence within the king's restructured court, a rebranding exercise that seems to leave no space for the Duchess of York. What makes this story impossible to ignore is not just the property itself, but the emotion that clings to its walls. The lodge was where Sarah raised her daughters, where the last echoes of the York marriage still linger. To see it handed over so clinically has sparked a wave of online sympathy, even among those who once dismissed her. "There's a sense she's being erased," one royal blogger noted, "like she's a ghost being swept out of Windsor," but insiders hint that Sarah may not go quietly. She still holds, somewhere among her private papers, letters from the late Queen, personal notes that, if genuine, could complicate the crown's claim to the estate. And those close to her say she has been unusually calm, a sign that she might already be planning her next move. When Sarah goes silent, an old palace aide remarked, "It usually means she's preparing to strike." For now, Buckingham Palace refuses further comment. Officially, the handover is set to take place within the coming months. Unofficially, the atmosphere is brittle. Even some within the royal household admit the optics are troubling. A king enforcing order while his brother's former wife faces exile from the only home she has known for decades. The headlines call it renewal. Her supporters call it revenge. And yet, as dusk settles over Windsor, one question remains. Is this truly about efficiency, or is it a final reckoning with the ghost of the Yorks? Those who follow the saga closely say this is only the opening move, because in royal chess, every piece has its price, and Sarah Ferguson has never been one to fold quietly. 3 days after the decree, the atmosphere inside Royal Lodge had shifted from shock to strategy. Sarah Ferguson, ever the survivor of royal storms, was no longer weeping over her loss. She was calculating. Those close to her describe a sudden change, from despair to deliberate calm, from disbelief to defiance. "She's done being silent," said one source familiar with her thinking. Sarah sees this not as an eviction, but as a provocation. In the quiet of her study, beneath portraits of the late Queen, Sarah unlocked a small walnut drawer that hadn't been opened in years. Inside lay a worn folder, pale blue, marked by time, containing documents she had never intended to use. It was the original Royal Lodge grant, personally signed by Queen Elizabeth II in 2003, granting indefinite occupancy to Prince Andrew and his family. To most, a sentimental relic. But in Sarah's eyes, a weapon. She's convinced it proves her right to stay, an old friend confided to the Telegraph. And more than that, she believes it's proof that the late Queen wanted York to endure. Those close to the palace say Sarah's decision to act was born not from pride, but from something deeper, a need to reclaim a sliver of dignity in a world that had long written her off. She began making calls, first to Harold Kinsley, Andrew's former financial advisor, a man who had seen the inner workings of royal estates for 3 decades. According to sources, Sarah arranged a discreet meeting in Chelsea, insisting on absolute secrecy. The goal: to verify the Queen's old paperwork and trace the technicalities of property usage under the Crown estate. If she could prove that Royal Lodge was granted privately, outside the usual Crown property system, explained one legal analyst, then she could at least challenge the narrative, if not the law itself. Meanwhile, whispers spread through Windsor. Staff who had once kept silent were now murmuring about the Duchess's rebellion. Inside Buckingham's advisory offices, aides began drafting contingency statements, worried that the issue might spill into the press. But it was already too late. The Sun had caught wind of Queen's old letters resurfacing, and speculation exploded. The question dominating headlines: was Sarah Ferguson quietly preparing to fight the king? Insiders say Sarah's anger was less about losing the house and more about being erased. She's been painted as irrelevant for years, one longtime associate told the Daily Mail. But she sees this as her last stand, the York legacy versus the new Windsor order. That framing, though melodramatic, was exactly how it felt within her circle. To them, this wasn't a property dispute. It was a symbolic battle for recognition in a monarchy that had moved on without her. At the same time, the Wessexes, Edward and Sophie, found themselves in an unexpectedly uncomfortable position. The couple had not requested the lodge directly, at least not publicly, and yet their names now sat at the heart of the controversy. They're the faces of the king's cleanup, noted a veteran royal commentator. But privately, they must know how cruel this looks. Oh, indeed, according to one insider, Sophie expressed unease during a late-night call with a royal aide. "I don't want to be seen as taking her home." Still, the official process had already begun. The Crown Estate had issued internal memos about transition of management and preliminary surveys. Every word bureaucratic, every line steeped in quiet finality. But Sarah wasn't waiting for paperwork. Those around her say she's been meeting with old allies, calling in favors, dusting off names from the past. Harold Kinsley, once known for his discretion, has reportedly agreed to help her explore all legal interpretations of the Queen's 2003 letter. "It's not just nostalgia," Kinsley allegedly told a friend. "She wants to show that the York family wasn't erased, only rewritten. And yet, her path is perilous." Within the royal machinery, Charles's resolve is firm. "The king believes this is about renewal," said a palace advisor. "He wants every royal residence to reflect purpose, not sentimentality." Still, others close to the court suggest a different hand guiding the move: the Queen consorts. Camilla's influence on household restructuring is understated but profound, one senior courtier remarked. She has little patience for ghosts of the past. To outsiders, the situation seems poised for quiet resolution. But to those watching closely, something far more volatile is brewing. "This isn't over," a source close to Sarah insisted. "She's not fighting for Andrew anymore. She's fighting for York, for herself, for the last thread connecting her to the monarchy that once defined her." And as royal reporters speculate on television panels and podcasts, the tone has shifted from gossip to intrigue. "We've seen scandals before," said one BBC analyst, "but this feels different, more strategic, more personal. It's not about who lives in Royal Lodge, it's about who still belongs in the royal story." By nightfall, Royal Lodge stood silent beneath the fog of Windsor, but the stillness was deceptive. Lights glowed in Sarah's study. Old papers lay scattered across the table, and her phone screen flickered with unread messages. The crisis had begun, and Sarah Ferguson, for all her missteps, was not about to leave the stage quietly. By the following week, the whispers had turned into headlines. Across breakfast tables and social media feeds, one question dominated royal talk. Had the Duchess of York just declared war on the crown? It began with a curious piece in the Telegraph. A small headline buried on page 5, "Wessexes Royal Lodge, Palace Divided." But within 24 hours, the story exploded. The Sun splashed it across the front page, claiming Sophie had been seen measuring curtains at Royal Lodge weeks before Andrew's expulsion. Tabloids ran with it, talk shows dissected it, and by the second morning, BBC analysts were already debating whether the king's advisors had overreached. The palace scrambled to contain the narrative. They couldn't. Inside Royal Lodge, Sarah watched the coverage with quiet satisfaction. Those close to her say she didn't make a single public statement, but she didn't need to. She set the fire and walked away, one insider admitted. Now everyone else is choking on the smoke. According to sources later confirmed by former staff, Sarah's hand was everywhere in the leak. Anonymous emails had been sent to royal correspondents using untraceable addresses, attaching what appeared to be fragments of internal meeting notes, lines suggesting Edward had privately requested reassignment of the lodge months earlier. Whether authentic or forged remains unclear. But in the digital age, perception moves faster than truth, and perception was already damning. For the first time in years, Edward and Sophie found themselves the focus of tabloid fury. Overnight, the couple once hailed as the monarchy's safe pair of hands were portrayed as ambitious and calculating. Online headlines read, "Sophie's secret visit to Royal Lodge, Wessex overreach, and has the perfect couple gone too far?" At Bagshot Park, the Wessexes' residence, tension reportedly ran high. A family friend told The Times, Sophie was in tears. She couldn't believe Sarah would stoop to this. Edward, known for his composure, was said to be livid. "He's always been loyal to the family," the friend continued. "He saw this as a personal betrayal." Meanwhile, the King's Advisory Council called an emergency session. Charles himself, sources say, was deeply displeased. Not with the Wessexes, but with the optics. "It looks like internal warfare," one aide lamented. Exactly what he wanted to avoid. Behind closed doors, Camilla reportedly advised, "Let it play out quietly. The press will move on." But it didn't. Every hour, another anonymous post surfaced, citing private correspondence or palace insiders. The media frenzy created its own storm of speculation. Was Sarah acting alone, or did she have help from sympathetic figures inside the institution? According to a veteran royal watcher, the precision of the leaks suggests she isn't improvising. She's playing a long game. Others weren't so sure. "She's reckless," said a former courtier. "This could destroy what little goodwill she has left." By Thursday, the pressure had become unbearable. Edward instructed his private secretary to issue a rare public statement denying all claims. It was brief but firm. "The Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh have made no request regarding Royal Lodge. Any suggestion to the contrary is entirely false." Yet, instead of calming the story, it fueled it. "If they're denying so strongly," one BBC pundit mused, "perhaps there's more to hide." In Windsor, staff described an atmosphere of unease. "You could feel it," said one longtime gardener. "Every window seemed to have eyes. Everyone was waiting for the next move." And they were right to wait, because while the press obsessed over Edward and Sophie, Sarah had already shifted her strategy. Insiders claim she began reaching out to journalists indirectly, through intermediaries she'd used decades earlier during her tabloid battles in the 90s. "She knows how to play the media," a royal historian commented. "She was built for it, trained by scandal." But this time, she wasn't selling gossip. She was shaping narrative. Her goal wasn't sympathy, it was legitimacy. If she could convince the public that Royal Lodge was a personal inheritance granted by the late Queen, she might force the palace into a defensive crouch. And she nearly succeeded. Late Friday, a BBC segment aired, quoting an unnamed source close to the York family, suggesting that the Queen herself had written, in her own hand, "Royal Lodge shall remain a refuge for York." No one could verify the quote, but it caught fire. Within hours, hashtags like #Save Royal Lodge and #Justice for York trended across X and TikTok. For the palace, it was a communications nightmare. Senior aides held late-night calls trying to manage the fallout. "This isn't just about property anymore," one aide warned. "It's about memory. She's weaponizing the Queen's legacy." That line hit hard, because for Charles and Camilla, the memory of Elizabeth II remains sacred, untouchable. For Sarah to invoke it so publicly, even indirectly, was seen as audacious, almost sacrilegious. Camilla was furious, an insider later revealed. She saw it as an act of emotional blackmail, but the effect was undeniable. Public sympathy tilted ever so slightly back toward the Duchess. Viewers of morning talk shows began to ask whether she had been treated unfairly. "It's like she's haunting them," one presenter joked. "The ghost of the Yorks refuses to vanish." As night fell, Sarah stood by the fireplace of Royal Lodge, television screens flickering with her own headlines. Her silence had become her strategy, her restraint, her weapon. But even as she watched her narrative take hold, she must have known that every story has a counterattack. Because at Bagshot Park, Edward and Sophie weren't just watching, they were preparing. The Duke had ordered a private review of every meeting Sarah had attended, every call she'd made, every whisper she'd spread. The Wessexes had been caught off guard once. It wouldn't happen again. The rumor war had begun, and for the first time in years, the British monarchy was fighting not on foreign soil or in Parliament, but in the invisible trenches of image, loyalty, and legacy. And in that battle, truth was only one of many casualties. By Monday morning, the whispers reached Clarence's house, and this time, they carried a name. Camilla, murmured the corridors. The Queen Consort's composure had cracked. According to a source close to her private office, she received an unmarked envelope at breakfast. Inside, a neatly typed letter accusing her of manipulating the king to favor Prince George's line over Wessex. The wording was sharp, the tone unmistakably provocative. The envelope had no return address, but the paper, it matched the stationery used at Royal Lodge. Camilla's reaction was immediate. "Who sent this?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the quiet of the morning room. Charles, calm as ever, told her not to engage, but palace staff later said her expression changed from disbelief to anger. "She hates to be accused of scheming," one aide recalled, especially when it hits that close to truth or perception. Within hours, she requested a meeting with Edward. For Sarah Ferguson, the move had been deliberate. After weeks of playing defense, she'd gone on offense, diverting the narrative away from herself and toward those she viewed as the architects of her downfall. The letter, insiders later confirmed, was pieced together from fragments of overheard conversations and gossip lifted from palace chatter, then polished to sound plausible. It accused the Queen Consort of quietly reallocating royal residences to consolidate influence over Charles's heirs. It was a perfect wedge, tailored to spark tension between the king, Camilla, and the Wessexes. She was no longer just fighting for a house, noted one BBC commentator. She was destabilizing the internal hierarchy. That afternoon, Edward arrived at Clarence's house, escorted through a side entrance to avoid photographers. Camilla was waiting, the anonymous letter laid out on the table between them like a weapon. "Explain this," she said coldly. Edward read the accusations twice, eyes narrowing. "This is absurd," he protested. "I never said these things." But Camilla wasn't listening. "I don't care who said them," she replied. "I care why they reached me." The meeting ended without resolution. But when Edward walked out, reporters caught the tension in his clenched jaw. That evening, palace correspondents began hinting at strained dynamics between royal households. Once again, Sarah's influence moved unseen but effective. Inside Royal Lodge, she watched the broadcast with measured satisfaction. "She's not celebrating," said a friend who visited that night. "She's just calculating." On her desk lay another file. This one marked Eliza Harper, a 28-year-old maid who had served Sophie for 4 years. Eliza's mother was gravely ill in Liverpool. Her wages barely covered medical costs. According to insiders, Sarah saw vulnerability and opportunity. Through an intermediary, she arranged a meeting at a discreet boutique hotel in Knightsbridge. The encounter lasted under an hour. It wasn't blackmail, a source familiar with the exchange claimed. It was persuasion. Sarah offered Eliza a quiet contribution to her family's needs, £20,000, and in return, asked for details about Sophie's daily routine and communications. Harmless, she called it. Background verification, but it was far from harmless. Days later, fragments of those details began appearing. Phrases Sophie had supposedly said in private, snippets implying she'd criticized Camilla's control over household matters. Camilla likes controlling everything, even others' property. Read one anonymous email to a tabloid editor. None of it could be confirmed, but it was enough to reignite a firestorm. When Camilla saw those words quoted on morning television, she was livid. "This is character assassination," she told Charles, "and it's coming from Windsor." Her suspicion turned squarely toward Sarah, though no proof yet existed. The king, weary of palace politics, ordered a quiet investigation. "Trace every leak," he told his advisors. At Bagshot Park, Sophie was unraveling. "She was devastated," said a family friend. "She kept asking who could have done this. When Edward suggested Sarah's name, she refused to believe it, until the second wave of leaks appeared, this time accompanied by selective evidence that seemed too precise to be coincidence. That's when doubt gave way to fury. Edward moved quickly. He called in his private security detail, former royal protection officers, and tasked them with compiling a dossier. "We'll track her," he said. "Every meeting, every call. The command was cold, surgical. Within 48 hours, they had surveillance logs. Sarah meeting Harold Kinsley in Chelsea, Sarah's car idling outside a Knightsbridge hotel, an envelope exchanged with an unidentified woman, later confirmed as Eliza. When Edward received the report, he said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, "She's using staff." Sophie's face, one aide recalled, went white. She felt violated, betrayed by someone she trusted, and by a woman she'd once defended. The palace's internal security division took over from there. Calls were monitored, financial transfers traced. What they found shocked even seasoned investigators. Multiple deposits from Sarah's personal account to a small trust in Eliza's name. Roughly £75,000 in total. It was the smoking gun no one had expected to find so soon. For the monarchy, it was a nightmare. A former duchess caught in a web of manipulation and money, a queen consort humiliated in headlines, and a loyal couple dragged through scandal. "It's like watching the crown devour itself," said one royal historian grimly. Yet amid the chaos, Sarah seemed untouched, still poised, still silent. When asked by a reporter outside Windsor if she had any comment on the rumors, she simply smiled and said, "Don't believe everything you read." All too. But those inside the palace knew the storm was only intensifying. Because the evidence trail didn't end at Eliza. It led back to Royal Lodge itself. And when it reached the king's desk, the reckoning would begin. By Thursday evening, the reckoning had arrived. A sealed letter bearing the king's crimson crest was delivered to Royal Lodge, addressed in formal script, to Sarah, Duchess of York, attendance required, Windsor, 6 o'clock. No explanation. No lawyer permitted. Just a time and a place. Sarah read it once, twice, then folded it neatly and set it on her desk. "It's time," she murmured. Those who saw her that afternoon said she moved with eerie calm, her hair pinned back, her coat pressed, as if preparing for a ceremony rather than a confrontation. At Windsor, the council chamber had been transformed into a private courtroom. King Charles sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by Queen Camilla, stone-faced, and the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh opposite, Edward stern, Sophie pale. At the far end, Harold Kinsley, the aging advisor who'd once managed Andrew's finances, sat with trembling hands, a reluctant witness to the storm he'd helped ignite. Charles began without preamble. "We are here," he said evenly, "to clarify certain matters concerning Royal Lodge." He gestured to a thick dossier before him. Inside lay the entire saga, transcripts, financial records, recordings, and emails, all traced back to Sarah Ferguson. When the evidence was read aloud, the room fell silent. The audio recording of Harold's car, the one capturing his muttered words, "She paid me 50 grand to spread rumors," played softly, every syllable hanging in the air. Sarah didn't flinch. "I was protecting my rights," she said, her voice steady. Then came the bank transfers, 3 payments to Eliza Harper's offshore trust. And finally, the anonymous letter to Camilla, its fingerprints matching the printer paper at Royal Lodge. "This is defamation and bribery," said the chief advisor. "A grave breach of royal protocol." Sarah's reply was almost defiant. "I defended the Queen's legacy," she said. "You call it deceit, I call it preservation." Camilla leaned forward, eyes cold. "You used Her Majesty's memory as a weapon." Sophie, her voice shaking, added, "You used my staff, my words, my home." Edward said nothing until the end. "This isn't about legacy, Aunt Sarah," he said quietly. "It's about trust, and you broke it." The king raised his hand, silencing the murmurs. "The council's decision," he declared, "is unanimous, effective immediately. All rights and access to Royal Lodge are revoked. The property will be transferred to the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh." For a moment, no one spoke. Sarah's expression didn't change, only her eyes flickered, bright and wet. "York will not die," she said softly. "You can take the house, not the name." As she stood to leave, Charles watched her with weary sadness. "I wish," he said, almost under his breath, "you'd chosen differently." Outside, dusk had fallen over Windsor. Cameras were banned, the gates were locked. Yet word of the meeting leaked within hours. It was brutal, one palace insider whispered to the press. But it had to be done. Inside the car that carried her away, Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe. The crown had won. The Yorks had fallen. But as she looked out at the fog curling over the park, she whispered a line only she could hear. "It isn't over." Dawn broke over Windsor like a quiet surrender. The air hung heavy with mist as the convoy of royal removal trucks rolled through the iron gates of Royal Lodge. Their engines hummed low, almost reverent, as if aware of the history they were uprooting. On the marble steps stood Sarah Ferguson, wrapped in a long camel coat, one hand gripping the worn leather suitcase that once belonged to Prince Andrew. It was all she chose to take. Inside, the rooms were stripped bare, no portraits, no laughter, just echoes. Sarah had spent the night walking through each corridor, touching the walls, whispering farewells to the ghosts of her past. "It's strange," a former staff member said. She looked calm, almost peaceful, like someone closing a chapter she wrote herself. Edward and Sophie arrived at first light. There were no cameras, no entourage, only silence and a sense of reluctant duty. The king had ordered the handover to be discreet, for dignity's sake, as one aide put it. The paperwork was brief: keys, codes, and one signature. Andrews, shaky and resigned, had been couriered the night before. Sophie lingered by the fireplace where the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II once hung. "Do you want to keep anything?" she asked softly. Sarah shook her head. "It's all yours now." The answer was steady, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. Edward, more formal than cold, nodded respectfully. "I never wanted this, Aunt Sarah." She smiled faintly. "Neither did I. But the crown always decides who stays and who leaves." Outside, the fog thickened. Sarah walked slowly toward her car, pausing once to glance back at the mansion, its tall windows glinting faintly behind the mist. It was no longer hers, yet part of her would always linger there, in the hush of the halls, in the faint trace of perfume woven into the curtains. "York will not die," she had said, and somehow the words still hung in the air, defiant and unbroken. By midday, Royal Lodge was sealed. Inside Buckingham's files, its name was quietly changed. Wessex Residence No. 1. Clinical. Soulless. Even Edward hesitated before signing the final confirmation. "It feels wrong," he muttered. Sophie took his hand. "Maybe," she said. "But it's done." Back in London, Sarah's car merged into traffic. No press followed, no crowd gathered. Only the city's endless hum accompanied her. She looked out the window, not angry, not broken, simply empty. For all the scandal and fury, she had fought her last battle with dignity. The lodge was gone, but her story had already outlived its walls. In the days that followed, royal reporters called it the quiet exile. Commentators debated legacy and reform, loyalty and loss. But among viewers, one question lingered. Had Sarah Ferguson truly been defeated, or had she managed, in her own way, to haunt the very institution that cast her out? Because sometimes, in the monarchy's long shadow, survival itself is a kind of victory. Thank you for watching the Royal Lodge Conspiracy. If you want to follow every hidden twist, betrayal, and legacy war within the House of Windsor, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The story may have ended here, but in the royal world, it's never really over.